They've added this new character because, as you saw, maybe the statistic, 1 in 68 children now have autism, and it's important for them to see a character they can identify with. What's also cool is the woman who runs the puppet, her own son has autism. So I thought that was pretty interesting. All right, so I'm here today to inform you about autism, which is considered a spectrum disorder, and it may be passed on through genes. Regardless of the cause, I think it's important for schools to know how to mainstream these students so everyone can benefit from having a class with an autistic student. First, I want to give you a little bit of information about the disorder itself. It's considered a spectrum disorder, and I kept hearing this word pop up in my research, Tony. Do you know what that word spectrum means? What does spectrum mean?
It's like a color spectrum, it's like goes around.
That's what I was thinking of too. So lots of different colors in the color spectrum. There's lots of different varieties of autism. I almost said what one of them was. It's considered Asperger's if you have very high functioning autism. So you might have heard of Asperger's before. It was named after a scientist named Asperger. And if you have the high functioning end of it, sometimes we also see in these children that they are blessed with unusual gifts. Maybe they have a knack for memorizing numbers. Ms. Hoffman, do you remember the movie Rain Man?
I do.
That's where my mind goes, someone like that. Some kids might be piano prodigies at a really young age. So for some reason, they're super gifted as well. Then you see children on the other side of the spectrum. And if you see someone with severe autism, sometimes they can't even vocalize. Sometimes they're too scared to even look up. It's like kind of like they're trapped inside their own head. And then a lot of times you may interact with people who have some version of it and not even know because they cope with it, they hide it so well. Najee, if you'll please put down your phone. Okay. I'll take questions at the end. What researchers call the low end of the spectrum, they describe children as mind blind. And that was new for me, but it makes sense. These children are blind to the idea that others' minds might not be like theirs. And so that's why they get into a lot of conflict, because they can't understand why you're not seeing the world the same way that they're seeing it. On the other end of the spectrum, right, I talked about the folks with unusual gifts. Have you heard of Silicon Valley in California?
Yeah. Nope.
Right? This is an area known for all kinds of inventions, and all of the dot-coms started there. And we're finding out that a lot of those computer nerds may have a form of autism too. And they've now called this the geek syndrome because they're high functioning and blessed with intelligence and also have autism. So I thought that was a cool rebranding of autism as a geek syndrome. All right, so literally the autistic brain is different from our brains. One abnormality comes in the limbic system. The limbic system controls your emotions. And for these children, it's like their limbic systems are immature. It's like waiting for something to activate it, and it just never has. Also, their cerebellum could be compromised, and the cerebellum controls muscle movement. So that's why sometimes they can't move or their movements might seem a little jerky. And finally, their brains might just be bigger. And that leads to other issues as well. Okay, let's talk about who has it. It's interesting because the statistic in my opener said 1 in 68 children, which is even more prevalent than my research, which said 1 in 50. So it just shows every year they're finding more and more cases. I tried to put that number into terms that made sense to me. When I think about how many students I could potentially teach in a year, if it's a busy year, I could potentially have 150 students. So that means one of my students each year could potentially have autism. And I think that's true this year. I had a student last semester, we'll call him John, who had a form of autism. And so now he's kind of the student I have in mind when all of this research, I'm reading my research. So they're wondering what's causing so many cases. There's got to be a genetic link, and scientists are finding a genetic link. I read a good analogy that made sense to me. Are any of you in orchestra? Do any of you play an instrument? Okay, so like it's in the band, right, Tyler? And so if all of the instruments are tuned and everyone has rehearsed, that song is going to sound incredible. Now, liken that to our genetic, like our DNA, right? All the genes that go into our DNA, right? If you just have one gene that's off, it can throw off the whole song, right? So if you just have one guy who hasn't practiced that tuba and he plays wrong, it's going to throw off that whole song. Same is true with our genetic structure. And so we're seeing that there's at least 3, if not 20 genes that might contribute to autism. Okay, it just tells you how complex all of this is. So finally, what is the impact on schools? So as one researcher says, if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. And at first I'm like, is that a typo? What does that mean? But I think what this researcher is trying to say is like, just because I had something that might have worked with John in the fall, right, doesn't mean that the next autistic student who comes through my door, I can apply that same strategy. Each child is different because autism is so different for every kid, right? And so it means it makes me appreciate even more the work they're doing in the elementary schools, right? That's where these kids are first going to school and all of the therapy that they need to be successful. So by the time I'm seeing John, he's pretty well equipped to do school, but it took a lot of work in the lower grades to get him there. So it makes me appreciate that. It also makes me appreciate, I came across research that says, quote, it is incorrect to say that autistic children are cold and indifferent to those around them. They actually show empathy. And do you know of anyone with any form of autism? You know, I have to admit, when I met John in the fall, I was like, who is this kid? He never smiled. He rarely laughed. There was rarely any, like, expression in his face. And I kind of took that as, like, standoffish or even rude. Then when I got to know John better, I'm like, oh, no, that's not who he is at all. In fact, he was in a rough class, and on really bad days, guess who would stick around and ask me how I was? John. And so that told me that John, even though he doesn't show a lot of emotion, he's feeling a lot of emotion. He showed a lot of empathy to me. So I tell you that in case you are in a class with an autistic student, please don't assume the worst about them, that there's probably a lot going on inside that they just can't express. And I think we're all better for having those kids in our classes. And I think we can expect to see more and more of those kids in our classes as we continue to go through school. So, in conclusion, even if you are too old to watch Sesame Street, I hope you show empathy towards those with autism. And while scientists still don't know definitively what causes autism, it is a spectrum disorder likely due to a genetic miscue. And with so many cases, we need to be aware of how we can integrate those students into our mainstream classes. Thank you.